Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Generation Deliverability Methodology Review Initiative stakeholder call to discuss revisions to the draft final proposal. My name is Caitlin McGee, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I'll be helping facilitate today's meeting. I'm also joined by Neil Miller, Vice President of Infrastructure and Operations Planning, Robert Sparks, Senior Manager, Regional Transmission South, and Danielle Mills, Principal of Infrastructure Policy. As a reminder, today's presentation and agenda can be found on the initiative webpage under the Stay Informed tab. Next slide, please. A few housekeeping reminders before we get started today. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We try to structure these meetings in a way to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives, but we do ask that you please keep your comments professional and respectful and try to refrain from repeating from what has already been said. Next slide, please. If you want to ask a question or make a comment during today's meeting, there's a few ways to do so. If you're connected through WebEx using your computer or the Call Me option, you can select the raise hand icon in the bottom right toolbar of the WebEx platform. If you're joining us through an audio only line, you can dial #2. That'll add you to the queue. And if you prefer, you can send your question or comment into the chat to all panelists, and I'll read it aloud for you. If you have need any technical assistance today during the meeting, you can send a chat to the event producer and they'll help you out. Next slide, please. And then before we get started, just a quick reminder, here's an overview of the California ISO's policy initiative stakeholder process. As you can see, we've worked through the straw proposal, and now we're here to talk about our revisions to the draft final proposal today. Next slide. So I'll hand it over to Danielle to take us through the agenda for today's meeting.
Thanks, Caitlin, and good morning, everyone. So for today's meeting, we plan to introduce some of the concepts behind the deliverability assessment methodology and then explore a summary of some of the key issues. Then we'll discuss the proposal in the draft final proposal and fill you in on some next steps with the schedule. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the ISO's deliverability methodology is to test that the transmission system can reasonably ensure that the RA capacity can be delivered to load during times of stress system conditions. Before we do this, though, these resources have to meet basic interconnection requirements so that they can be reliably interconnected and they could operate energy only without seeking a deliverability allocation and without providing RA capacity. Next slide, please. Just a bit of background on the ISO's deliverability initiative and process. In 2005, it was developed and accepted by FERC and the CPUC, and the ISO began to use it in 2006 with a lot of guidance from PJM's model and recognizing that that MISO uses a similar approach. A comprehensive review was conducted in 2019 and 2020 in response to a changing resource fleet and a changing shift, and this led to the current high system need and secondary system need approach that we use right now. Other adjustments have been made over time as well. We've aligned a relaxation of the WEC standard. We've adjusted the dispatch levels for storage. And recently we've had requests for another review. And so the ISO explored this in the policy catalog, raised a number of new concepts not expressed in the earlier review. And this led to the ISO producing an update paper in December 2022. And an issue paper, which was released on May 31st, as well as a straw proposal in the summer. The next slide, please. I just want to highlight, too, that all of these issues that we're exploring in the Deliverability Assessment Methodology Initiative also have ties to other initiatives that we're working on. So certainly the Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative, as well as the Resource Adequacy Initiative at the ISO as well. And as we think through how we identify transmission needs and manage transmission needs, It's important just to highlight here that the transmission planning process is where we approve larger area deliverability upgrades for preferred zones, and that capacity is then allocated among resources that move forward. In the generator interconnection process, we identify smaller local deliverability upgrades that depend on the specific resources inside of the zones. We also identify reliability requirements needed to allow the resource to physically connect and be energized, and we identify interconnection requirements as well in that process. So I'll turn it here, I believe, on the next slide over to Neil to go through the summary of the proposed changes in the draft final proposal.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. Yes, and I'll walk through the summary here, but then we'll be going through each of these in turn, or Robert Sparks will be leading through the more comprehensive deck to touch on these. We did think it would be helpful, though, just to provide a quick summary up front on the changes or what we're looking to carry forward from the straw proposal into the draft final proposal. First off, on the study of the high system need and secondary system need, we are intending to move forward essentially with the original proposal to eliminate the secondary system need. In our technical report, and as Robert will touch on, we have provided additional study results to demonstrate the impact of storage versus the high hydro conditions in the previous analysis that raised some stakeholder concerns. So we'll be able to walk through that. Regarding dispatch levels, we have reviewed the material as well as what's happening with the CPUC slice of day approach. And at this point, we don't believe any additional changes are appropriate at this time, consistent with the straw proposal. And we are looking at expecting to have to continue to monitor the situation as the slice of day and exceedance methodology that's being used in the slice of day approach evolves. On the simultaneous dispatch issue, we are continuing to look to the broader resource adequacy discussion about local RA requirements versus system requirements. But the one change that we are looking at here, consistent with the straw proposal, is to raise the distribution factor threshold for 500 kV lines from 5% to 10% for 500 kV constraints. On the study of N-2 contingencies on double circuit towers, in terms of the content itself, we're proposing to the same overall methodology that we've laid out in the straw proposal. There are two things, though, that we've done. One is to provide additional clarification and narrative about operationally how the risk assessments are considered and how they are considered differently in operations for cascading versus non-cascading N-2 outages. And we've also clarified, based on a lot of very helpful input, clarified the level of deliverability that would be provided while the N-2 non-cascading mitigations are being developed. That as we went through the details, we recognize that there really isn't a conditional deliverability being applied, that services receiving deliverability under this framework would be receiving the full or partial deliverability that they otherwise qualified for. So there isn't a need for a new term on conditional deliverability. Regarding the ADNU, LDNU guidelines, the criteria we use to separate area deliverability network upgrades from local deliverability network upgrades, we had not actually made a proposal in the straw proposal because the issue was being raised for the first time, but the concerns and issues were highlighted. Based on the feedback that we received, we are proposing a change for one of the criteria to shift the current $20 million threshold to a $60,000 per megawatt. And I apologize, as this slide is being turned into a PDF, I see that there was some additional garbled text added that we will clarify when we repost the deck. So there we are looking at making a change that would result in raising the threshold somewhat between local and area deliverability network upgrades. The last change that we made is more procedural. We had proposed in the straw proposal the concept of providing some sort of conditional deliverability if network upgrades were delayed by transmission owners. In hindsight, and as we reviewed the comments as well as conducting additional internal review, we realized that this issue is part of a broader IPE concern around getting projects deliverable and getting connected. And it really isn't a methodology issue that should be getting resolved in this framework. So we are proposing to move that to the IPE initiative instead of carrying forward a recommendation in the methodology discussion. So that's an overview. We will be walking through the details and looking to answer questions, but let me stop there first to see if there are any more process-related questions I could help with before I turn it over to Robert to walk through the details of what I just summarized.
Let's open up the line for Fernando Cornejo. Go ahead.
With SE. Thanks, Neil, for that overview. Really appreciate it. Just one question regarding the last item that you just discussed on delayed deliverability upgrades and moving that over to the IPE. Is that something that's going to be part of the 2023 IPE, or is that a full future to be determined IPE?
I should probably turn that over to Danielle, but Danielle, I just see you popped on. Danielle?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we are planning to put a notice out on this today or tomorrow, but we do plan to include it in this track of, well, this version of the IPE. It may be a new track to address deliverability issues more broadly. So maybe a track 3.
A track 3 that would not go to the CAISO board with all the other topics that are currently part of 2023 IPE?
Correct, but hopefully shortly thereafter.
Great, thank you, appreciate that, Danielle.
All right, that's the only question I see at this time.
Okay. Well, then I'll turn it over to Robert Sparks to walk through the more comprehensive deck. Robert?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So these are the same 6 items that Neil just went through. I will go through them in a little more detail and summarize stakeholder comments and ISO responses. And of course, there are much more details in the draft final proposal paper. We're just hitting the highlights here in the this presentation or in this meeting. My camera's not working too good. Next slide, please. I'm having internet problems.
Can you hear us, Robert?
Yeah, no, I had my internet froze for a second there. So starting with the first topic, as we have discussed, there are 2 different study scenarios. The HSN scenario studies the highest metered load condition and is the primary study scenario. There's also the SSN study scenario, which studies actually higher customer load, but more of the load is being served by rooftop solar. This scenario focuses on the time period when solar is dropping off and other resources are ramping up. This proposal, however, is to no longer study the SSN scenario in generation interconnection studies, as we've said. Next slide, please. So almost all stakeholders supported the ISO proposal, but there were some comments. A stakeholder requested that the ISO demonstrate that a single HSN analysis can reliably ensure that resources are deliverable to the aggregate of demand for every hour of the day. A stakeholder also requested that the ISO provide 2023 summer assessment study results with normal hydro assumptions, as Neil mentioned, and I'll show those in the slide or two. In response to the first bullet, it has been demonstrated that resources are deliverable during resource shortage conditions based on recent past experience. And we have been using this deliverability methodology for some time. So it seems to be fairly good demonstration that resources are deliverable with the practices we've been following. The second bullet is addressed in the following slides. Next slide, please. Previously, the ISO explained that recent summer assessments showed that resource shortage conditions can occur during the SSN study period. However, during the 2023 summer assessment, that report indicated that the risk of resource shortages during the SSN period may be less of a concern. Next slide, please. In response to the stakeholder request, this chart shows that under normal hydro conditions, the analysis no longer shows a significant shortfall risk during the ramping period as the fleet evolves. Next slide, please. So based on stakeholder comments and the most recent summer assessment information, the ISO continues to propose to remove the SSN scenario from generation interconnection studies. However, we will continue to perform the SSN study in the transition planning process as a screening tool for further analysis. So that's it on this item. Are there any questions?
And just a reminder for folks, if you want to ask a question, you can click the raise hand icon in the bottom right toolbar, or drop your question or comment into the chat. So at this time, I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, good. Next slide, please. The next topic is the generation dispatch levels assumed in the deliverability study. Some stakeholders might have gotten the wrong impression that the ISO is simultaneously stressing every generation pocket at the same time in its deliverability methodology. However, that's not the case. Providing a little explanation of what we actually do, generation outages and generation availability is random, and there are many possible future generation availability scenarios that could result in resource shortages. The study tool looks at thousands of different dispatch scenarios that could occur on the transmission system, but each scenario represents just one different possible future generation dispatch pattern that could occur. And each scenario is looked at one at a time as just a single point in time scenario, but focuses on the portion of the transmission system that is most stressed in that scenario. So in those scenarios, wind and solar generators are dispatched up to their 20% exceedance level in the HSN study, and then other generators are dispatched up to their NQC level. Next slide, please. Although some stakeholders appeared to understand the ISO's arguments for needing to study higher wind production amounts than the NQC value, there were a few remaining stakeholders that repeated the earlier comment that the dispatch levels for RA resources be set at their NQC levels and no higher. One stakeholder was under the impression that typically a higher level of generation dispatch is modeled in the deliverability assessment due to concerns about congestion and renewable curtailments. They also commented that the ISO should allow for reasonable redispatch to mitigate overloads. Another comment was that the ISO should begin contemplating how it will use preliminary hourly values for the slice of day framework in its deliverability studies. Next slide, please. So in response to the comment about the NTC levels, we went through this slide in the last stakeholder meeting, but I think it's worth repeating because it does demonstrate why setting the NQC value for wind generation is not appropriate for a deliverability study. The ELCC-based NQC values for solar and wind resources are based on stochastic simulations. And the values represent just a theoretical equivalent generator. For example, a 100 megawatt wind generator that has a 14 megawatt NQC is deemed to provide the same average contribution to overall reliability across a period of time as a 14 megawatt generator that is able to produce 14 megawatts in all hours. In other words, it's like a 14 megawatt perfect generator. In reality, though, the individual wind would be producing nothing, 0 megawatts in many hours. But many hours would be producing much more than 14 megawatts. But through the stochastic analysis, it sort of evens out as when there's many generators as an equivalent generator. At least that's the theory behind it. However, if the transmission were constrained to only allow that 14 megawatts of NQC, it could never produce more than 14 megawatts during stress system conditions, which is when we need it, and it would no longer be equivalent to a 14 megawatt perfect generator. Next slide, please. In response to the comment about the deliverability study trying to address congestion issues, the purpose of the on-peak deliverability study is to ensure that resources are deliverable during high load and resource shortage conditions. The market impacts of transmission constraints and congestion during ample supply conditions are just beyond the scope of the on-peak deliverability study and not part of it. So we're not trying to address congestion issues. On the topic of redispatch, overloads are not allowed above applicable emergency facility ratings. Therefore, redispatch must be done before the contingency occurs, so any redispatched amount is not available to serve loads under resource shortage conditions. Next slide, please. The ISO has been reviewing the CPUC exceedance values as part of its slice of day implementation, as part of the CPUC slice of day implementation. And we will continue to monitor the development of NQC values and evaluate the need for further updates to the deliverability methodology. Otherwise, the ISO is not proposing any fundamental changes to the dispatch levels and believes that its approach for determining dispatch levels in the deliverability studies is reasonable. So that's it on this topic. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we do have a couple hands raised. So let's go to Dariush Shirmuhamadi first. Go ahead.
Robert, can you hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Perfect, perfect. Could you remind me again, and I asked this question before, whether did that 20% exceedance number come from?
Yeah, so the deliverability methodology, when it was first implemented 15 years ago, as I think was mentioned earlier, we took a look at what the industry was doing, and PJM, had a good approach for doing deliverability studies, and they were looking at essentially making sure that the resources were deliverable 80% of the time during stress system conditions. And so we've been using that 80%, 20%, 80% deliverable, 20% not deliverable as pretty much the design target, if you will.
Do you know if PJM is still using that 20% number? Exceedance number?
They have made some updates. They were using the forced outage rates of all the generators and then adding generators to the stress system condition until the simple probability got to like a 20% probability of that scenario. They have actually backed away from that detailed approach. I'm not sure why, but they did. And I think they just did what we did, which was they just picked a certain number of units to still reflect that. But that's certainly what we've been doing ever since, and I think that's basically what they're still doing.
But when they pick that certain number of units, are they still assuming 20% exceedance for those certain number of units?
I expect they are. I haven't had that detailed discussion with them. I think it was mostly just a matter of
they don't. But I understand. But let's not argue with that. Do you know of any other?
Mostly just a lot of administrative work to look at all the forest outage rate data and put it into tools. But I just observed that that's a recent change they made.
Good enough. So do you know of any other ISO that uses that exceedance, any exceedance number as opposed to NQC number? The QC number, not NQC, QC number.
I don't know of any ISO that even has QC numbers.
Well, most ISOs have, and they use the LCC, but that's not the question. All right. So this slide 21 is very helpful. Under the new PUC approach, the RA value or QC value, not the RA value. QC value doesn't become RA value until CAISO blesses it. So the QC value of a resource is calculated based on an exceedance type approach. So would you be adopting PUC's exceedance-based approach when you modify your deliverability methodology to deal with PUC's new 24-hourly RA framework?
Darius, it's Neil here. I should probably cut in on that. Our intention is to review the deliverability framework or the RA framework developed through the CPUC proceeding, and have to hold off making any decisions about what we do or won't do until we actually see what it looks like. We can't commit in advance to following something that we don't know what it is yet. So we have committed to a review once that methodology is the RA reform CPUC is finalized. But in terms of what aspects, how it would be used, I don't think it's reasonable to ask us to commit now to something we haven't seen yet.
Fair. One last item. I understand that you use deliverability methodology in two contexts. One is in the context of GIDAP or GIP, which the goal is to determine whether a project is eligible to provide RA capacity, or whether a project is deliverable or not. And the other one is in operational type studies that you use in TPP. Of course, if there has been any emphasis on our part being, I'm speaking on behalf of California Wind Energy Association, has been that we have no qualm about what you do in the context of TPP, because those are operational type studies. But for the purpose of whether a resource can offer its qualifying capacity for the purpose of RA counting, only RA counting, our emphasis has been on that the level of dispatch matters. If a resource for the purpose of RA counting, that wind resource you mentioned, only can offer 14 megawatt. It can only offer 14 megawatt. In other words, even if you give it transmission capacity for 56 megawatt and it's available, we are not talking about actual operational study, but an RA counting exercise. if you set aside 56 megawatt of TPP capacity for it, TPD capacity for it, while it can only use that for 14 megawatt of RA number, QC number, for the purpose of RA counting. Again, this is not an operational case. Our concern has been you're putting too much TPD capacity aside for it and not allowing more reliable projects, more dependable project, dispatchable projects to get that TP capacity and offer it to you when you need it. But I just was a statement. I don't expect an answer. Thank you very much.
Any more questions?
No, that is it.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so the next topic is that the ISO proposed to raise the current 5% DFAX threshold for 500 kV line overload constraints to 10%. This will better exclude generators that have an insignificant impact on the high capacity and low impedance 500 kV line constraints. Next slide, please. So practically all stakeholders agreed with the ISO's proposal. However, a couple of stakeholders commented that we should also raise the DFAX threshold for 500 to 230 kV transformers and for 230 kV lines. And next slide, please. So in response to that comment, keep in mind that the rating of 500 to 230 kV transformers are typically around 1100 MVA, and the rating of 230 kV lines are typically less than 1000 MVA, whereas the rating of 500 kV lines are typically over 2000 MVA. In addition, the impedance of 500 to 230 kV transformers and 230 kV lines tend to be significantly higher than for 500 kV lines. So the reasoning for increasing the DFAX for 500 kV lines is because of their low impedance and high ratings. But the same reasoning does not equally apply to 500 to 230 kV transformers or 230 kV lines. So that's it on that topic. Are there any questions?
No questions at this time.
Okay, next slide, please. The straw proposal recommended continuing with the study of N-2 contingencies, but to shift the application of those results on a risk-based approach to better balance the need to access resource adequacy capacity. The NERC reliability standards require common mode N-2 contingency analysis and corresponding mitigation and generation interconnection studies. And excessive reductions of output on a sustained basis to manage the risk of an N-2 contingency contradicts the premise that the resources should be available to serve load. Next slide, please. Stakeholders supported the ISO's proposed changes to the treatment of N-2 contingencies. However, there were diverging comments from stakeholders. Some stakeholders commented that N-2 contingencies should only be considered in the transmission planning process, but not in the deliverability studies. Some stakeholders supported the consideration of N-2 contingencies in the deliverability studies, but only in the transmission planning process and not in the deliverability studies in the generation interconnection process. Next slide, please. Covering more comments, the next few slides summarize the responses to those comments in the draft final proposal paper. The deliverability methodology is based on the purpose of the resource adequacy program, ensuring the capability to provide service in all but the most extreme conditions and without relying on non-RA resources. The NERC planning standards require the system to be planned so that the system will operate reliably over a wide range of system conditions and contingencies. The standard also requires the system to remain stable and without cascading and uncontrolled islanding. The standard allows for system adjustments if such adjustments can be completed within a duration of the critical facility rating. Therefore, redispatch of resources needed to mitigate flows above facility ratings must be done before the contingency occurs. And next slide, please. Oh, I think I forgot to advance the slide last time. Next slide, please. Or maybe I skipped the slide. Anyway, so the stakeholders expressed concerns that it would be discriminatory to temporarily relax the requirements for non-cascading outage mitigations, while not also relaxing the requirements for cascading outages. However, the circumstances, consequences, and operational alternatives are all different between cascading and non-cascading contingencies. Stakeholders also suggested that the ISO's reasoning is inconsistent in its application of the NERC planning standard by offering deliverability for resources waiting for non-cascading N-2 contingency mitigations to be developed. However, this is not the case. TPL1 specifically anticipates that corrective actions cannot always be put in place in the required timeframe, and that is still compliant with the standard, provided that the actions being taken to resolve the situation are documented. Next slide, please. So in response to comments about only addressing N-2 contingencies in the reliability studies, the ISO's current reliability and deliverability studies are required to ensure that the reliability and deliverability of the resources interconnected. Establishing a bright line between the two studies can be challenging to ensure that there are no gaps. Removing N-2 contingencies from the deliverability studies would require major revisions to the reliability studies and result in duplication of efforts between the reliability studies and the deliverability studies. The ISO notes that this is less of a concern in jurisdictions that do not allow remedial action schemes or congestion management as mitigation in the reliability analysis. Next slide, please. In response to comments about conditional deliverability, as Neil mentioned, with further review of the overall construct, the ISO agrees that it is not necessary to introduce a conditional deliverability term. The resource would simply would receive full capacity deliverability status or partial capacity deliverability status during the period that the only pending mitigation is for a non-cascading N-2 outage. Next slide, please. So this slide reiterates the proposal regarding the treatment of N-2 contingencies in the deliverability study. If an N-2 contingency results in an overloaded facility, but not cascading outages, then upgrades would be required, but would not delay generation projects from becoming deliverable. Generation projects would be eligible for FCDS or PCDS during the development period of the transmission upgrades necessary to mitigate the N-2 contingency, assuming that no other constraints are binding. If a cascading outage risk is identified, or if the N-2 contingency is considered always credible in the operations horizon, then the mitigation for that contingency would be required before the assigned or later generation projects behind that constraint could obtain FCDS or PCDS. So that's it on the N-2 item. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we have a couple hands raised. So let's go to Lexi Orkin with AES Clean Energy. Go ahead.
Talking from AS Clean Energy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Robert, thank you so much for the presentation. And I think overall we're in favor of the proposed change of how you will be treating the N-2 outage. But we were hoping to obtain some additional clarity of the analysis that the CAISO is planning to use to evaluate if the outage is cascading or not. Will you be using a cluster case or a reliability case? That's one question. It's based on our understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, you will be using the powerful cascading test, which takes out the contingencies in reviews if any additional circuits are overloaded, and if they are, you will remove them from service as well. And until there's non-convergence, and that's the test you will be used to evaluate if it's a cascading outage. And the second part of the question is we have a bit of a concern because based on this methodology, we believe a lot of the constraints could fall under the cascading outage criteria because a lot of the constraints are on the 500 kV network and 230 kV network. So if you can say a couple of things regarding our concern, that would be great. And how you evaluate whether the outage is cascading or not. Thank you.
Yeah, so the paper, I'm pretty sure, contains a reference to the RC West SOL, IROL determination methodology. I forget the exact title, but we put the link in the paper. And it has basically instructions for performing a cascading analysis. We're planning on following that. We used to have a planning, IROL, SOL methodology, but that standard is being retired, and so now just the RC has such a methodology. So we'll follow the RC methodology, which is pretty much the same one we had in planning for that particular item. So hopefully that's clear. Hopefully you looked at that, or if you haven't, please go take a look. That's a documented approach on the public website. As far as which base case, so we have the cluster studies. I guess the expectation will be that there will be some cascading analysis that will be done in the cluster studies. Seems, like just a matter of due diligence to include it in the cluster studies. Also in the transition planning studies, when we're triggering the projects to mitigate the N-2, we'll also do some cascading analysis in the transmission planning process. I guess I'm not sure what else in your question you were looking for.
No, this is very helpful. Just, I guess our concern is there were a lot of N-2 overloads in the deliverability assessment, based on my memory. So our concern is that a lot of these constraints will not pass the cascading outage test. And I guess maybe a recommendation would be once you conduct the analysis, if you can let the stakeholders know which one of the constraints fall under the cascading outage and which ones don't, that would be very helpful for our planning purposes.
Yeah, well, both the cluster studies and the transition planning studies are available to stakeholders, so that will definitely be available to you as a generation developer and stakeholder.
Yes, just as far as indicating which ones are cascading, which ones will fall under the N-2 category, and which ones you can get deliverability immediately, that portion of the analysis. If you can make that available, that'd be very helpful. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so just to try and finish up the answer to the question, like I said, we would do the cascading analysis as part of the cluster studies, document that in the report as to the cascading analysis that was done, what the results were, what they mean, how we're potentially going to use them. And then in the transition planning study, I would expect the same thing. Now, we haven't done it yet, but I would expect we would fully document the studies for review. Any other questions?
That's all I have for now, thanks.
Are there any other stakeholder questions, I guess? Yeah.
Yes, let's move to Dariush.
Hello, Robert. So first of all, I want to, as one entity who has been pushing for removal of N-2 contingency for the purpose of identifying whether projects are eligible to provide RA capacity. I would like to acknowledge the fact that the way CAISO goes about generation interconnection studies is different from other jurisdictions. And the way you have the deliverability and reliability studies intertwined, in a way intertwined, it's going to make it more difficult for you to go about this if N-2 is focused. The focus for N-2 goes into reliability study and taken out of deliverability study the way both PJM and MISO do it. Well, when it comes to GitUp or GIP, their GIP, they do N-2 reliability. CAISO has other considerations that they don't. So I'd like to acknowledge that. So I have.
But I mean, it's part of that, though. They don't allow generators to interconnect if there's a reliability problem.
Right.
So there's certainly a linkage there.
Correct. But in this particular case, the question that we were having is whether a project can get a badge. Again, this is not system operation. This is whether a generation project with a QC can count on that QC for RA counting and RA counting alone. Now, again, I'm not going to dwell on this issue too much. I just want to ask this issue of cascading outages. In effect, you're basically saying, given that you're going to give people a quote unquote free pass or something to connect and get deliverability, not conditional, just straightforward deliverability, if the N-2 upgrades are delayed or not there. So would you, at the time that you tell folks whether they're behind cascading outages, N-2 cascading outages, rather than non-cascading outages, will you offer that information to generators at the time of the phase 1, phase 2 study, or maybe subsequent reassessment studies, or they will discover that only on the year that they discover that the upgrades tied to the N-2 is being delayed? So that they know upfront at the time that they receive the studies from you, whether they're going to be free from, they could get deliverability even those upgrades are delayed.
Yeah, so this is similar to the last question.
Yeah, I know, but somehow I did not follow your answer.
So again, in the cluster studies, we would perform the analysis and identify which contingencies, N-2 contingencies, are resulting in cascading. In the transition planning process, we would do the same thing. For these purposes, those are mostly information because nobody's actually getting deliverability in the transition planning process or in the cluster process for that matter. That you maintain yourself eligible for deliverability, but you really get deliverability in the TPD allocation process, as we call it. But the TPD allocation process would be looking back to the transmission planning studies and probably the cluster studies, and we've already committed to, when we allocate TPD, we'll identify all the transmission projects that TPD is contingent on. So certainly for N-1s, they're going to need to, well, subject to further evaluation. But currently today, any transmission projects needed for N-1, you need to wait. But if it's an N-2 and there's no cascading issues, well, anyway, we'll identify all the projects. I think we call them precursor projects, or if they're LDNUs, they'll actually be assigned projects. We'll do a better job of documenting that in the TPD allocation report, and tracking that. I think that's probably one of the places where there is a little room for improvement.
And Robert, it's Neil. I just wanted to tag on that granting this deliverability while the N-2 non-cascading mitigation is pending, that would apply whether the N-2 mitigation was delayed, or even if it had been was on its original schedule, but its original schedule was the last upgrade required. This isn't something that would only apply if the N-2 mitigation was delayed.
Understood.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, there was confusion on that, I think, in the comment.
That's a very important comment. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, that's all we have for questions.
Okay. Let's move on to the next slide. Oops. So, transmission constraints identified in the on-peak deliverability study are classified as area constraints and local constraints. In that framework, constraints with large amounts of generation behind them that trigger high-cost network upgrades are classified as area constraints, and corresponding area delivery network upgrades are identified. This framework is designed to avoid the identification of excessive delivery network upgrades that would be assigned to customers despite only being needed for generation amounts far beyond the expected amount of generation development in the ISO's long-term transmission planning process. Next slide, please. Stakeholders provided feedback on revising the ADNU and LDNU guidelines. One stakeholder commented that the ISO should update all the dollar limits in the ADNU criteria to account for inflation, and that the index applied to the RNU reimbursement limit could be used for this purpose as well. Another commented that since the ADNU cost allocations are based on megawatts, a $1 per megawatt threshold should be used. Next slide, please. So in response to those comments, the RNU reimbursement limit determines how much of the allocated cost of an upgrade would be directly refunded to an interconnection customer. In contrast to that, the ADNU guidelines determine which upgrades are funded by an interconnection customer, but then fully reimbursed, and versus which upgrades are assessed for need in the transmission planning process. So the ADNU guidelines are not a reimbursement limit, whereas the RNU is clearly a reimbursement limit. Also, the ADNU metrics are intended to be guidelines, so continually updating them for inflation is just not aligned with the idea that they're guidelines. Next slide, please. The ISO agrees with the $1 per megawatt threshold comment and proposes to change the guideline as shown in this slide. The $20 million threshold would be changed to $60,000 per megawatt to a $60,000 per megawatt threshold, and that value would be adjusted with the RNU reimbursement limit as proposed by the stakeholder. The ISO may also revisit the criteria for delineating area and local constraints in the IPE process, which may result in further proposed changes. And if so, the ISO would combine any additional changes with this proposed change in the BPM change management process. So are there any questions on this one?
Yeah, let's open up the line for Dariush.
Hi, Robert. So this $60,000 per megawatt, is it calculated based on total megawatt of deliverability that an upgrade offers, or the total megawatt of projects that in that particular study are behind this upgrade, in need of this upgrade?
We put an example in the paper. Let me pull up the paper. Oops. No.
Based on that example, what would be your answer?
I'm trying to remember, to be honest with you.
Okay. That's fine. So the second question I have,
So in the example, it is it's the total amount of projects behind the constraint that would be assigned the cost of the upgrade.
Understood.
Okay.
So
okay, good.
The second question is, the $60,000 per megawatt that applies to RNU is already around $80,000 per megawatt because of the inflation, or what escalation, whatever. Is that the number you're going to apply, or are you going to start with $60,000 now and use escalation rate going forward?
No, it would be the same as the RNU, but if you look at the tariff or the BPM, I forget where I look. I think it's the tariff, actually. I think that number might be right in the tariff. It still says $60,000 per megawatt, even for the RNU limit. And then it has that other language in there. So it's really just meant to mirror the RNU limit, and this is what's in the tariff.
So currently it's about $80,000 per megawatt, because the other one is around $80,000 per megawatt.
Yeah, that was the number I used in the example, or we used in the example.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
All right, let's move to Rachel Burke.
Thank you for the conversation on this topic. I was wondering if you guys have any analysis on how many upgrades historically would have been pushed into the TPP based on the current threshold rather than staying in the JIDAP.
Can you repeat that last thing you said?
How many upgrades historically would have been pushed into the TPP based on this new threshold versus the $20 million limit?
Yeah, so if you look at the transmission capability limits paper, or the transmission capability limits information that we posted on our website, it was just recently updated a couple of months ago. There's an Excel spreadsheet that goes along with it that actually has all the details and has the meaningful information. You can see how much the upgrades cost there in that spreadsheet. And you can see the ones that cost more than 20 million, the ones that cost less than 20 million. And so that'll give you an idea of how many the 20 million applied to, I suppose. And, assuming the past reflects the future, you could kind of expect the same kind of going forward, I suppose. Of course, there's no guarantees. As far as the $60,000 per megawatt, I admit I didn't go through and check and see how many, but you can see how many would be revisited and this new criteria would apply to, at least.
All right. We do have 2 more hands raised, so let's go to Shakul Mazari.
Savian. I think I'm a bit confused about this ADC-C4. So what is this dollar amount, $60,000 per megawatt? And if I look at the most recent document on the RNU upgrade reimbursement maximum, that says it's $85,430 per megawatt, including the inflation factor of 1.123%. So I'm kind of confused between these two dollar amounts per megawatt. So,
Yeah,
so what is $60,000 and what is $85,000 per megawatt?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
So I'm kind of confused between what is the $85,000 per megawatt of, what is the maximum RNU reimbursement dollar amount, and what is the $60,000 per megawatt that's, that ISO proposes for the ADC-C4.
Yeah, so that's
yeah, go ahead.
So that's the similar question to what Darius just asked. And the $60,000 number is what's in the ISO tariff. So the $80,000 or the $85,000, that is all linked to language in the ISO tariff that has the number $60,000 in there. So that's why this proposed BPM language just mirrors what's in the tariff.
Okay.
And then the language that continues on is also mirroring what's in the tariff. But it's and you can see in the example that we used $80,000 in the example because that was the number that was flying around. And yeah, I think that was maybe the number from in the comments. Sounds like you're saying it's 85,000.
Yes.
But it's meant to it's all the same number. I guess it depends on the point in time that you are.
Okay. Got it.
Good. So that was it for your question?
Yeah.
Great. Any more questions?
Let's move to Pushkar.
Pushkar Wagli from Twin Resource Consultants. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Pushkar.
Hey, I just had one clarifying question. If I understand correctly, the RNU reimbursement is, you do get reimbursement for them up to, per tariff 60,000 now adjusted for inflation, whatever the number is, 85K now. And beyond that, I guess you have to upfront fund it in terms of, for the ICs to upfront fund it without reimbursement as far as the RNU is concerned. But by reading not the presentation, but the draft final proposal, I got the impression that as far as this ADNU, LDNU guidelines are concerned, you're just using that threshold to distinguish between the two in terms of which gets assessed in the open stakeholder transmission planning process, which is ADNU versus the LDNU in the generation interconnection process. But it's not exactly a reimbursement limit as such. You're just using that threshold just to distinguish between the LDNU and RDNU, but not per se. So it's not that if you have any LDNU beyond above that particular threshold of 60,000 adjusted for inflation, that wouldn't be actually be reimbursed. Did I get that right, or I'm confusing between it?
No, I think you got it right.
Okay, so it's purely a sort of you're using that threshold to distinguish between the two, and it's not a reimbursement limit per se for LDNU the way it is for the RNUs. Correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. That's all I had.
All right, and then I think our last question from Jerry Melcher. Go ahead.
Hello, this is Jerry Melcher with Public Advocate Office. Just trying to understand what or how does the proposed generation deliverability methodology changes affect interconnection of new resources in light of the TPP transmission interconnection zones?
Well, that's a big question.
It's a big ask.
Well, it's a very general question, I guess. So you're trying to understand how the generation interconnection process and the transmission planning process are coordinated together? Can I reframe your question that way?
Well, yes, broadly, we've seen a shift coming out of TPP on the last 2022, 2023, where you've said, okay, here's these 9 transmission interconnection zones where we're going to announce capacity or capacity behind restraints, with those restraints are removed, constraints, I should say. And, that would give a resource developer indication that if he proposed a resource in one of those TIZs where capacity is available, other than paying for the local network upgrades or reliability upgrades, that he could lock and load against that capacity that's posted his resource and move forward with his project, getting full capacity deliverability services. Am I reading that wrong?
Robert,
Well,
go ahead.
So, okay, go ahead, Neil.
Well, yeah, it's Neil here. I was just going to jump in on that, the whole bigger picture framework, that the interconnection process enhancements efforts, one of the topics there is what further refinement does the ISO need around what constitutes a zone? So we're working to keep these processes in lockstep, but even in the interconnection process enhancements effort, the idea is that we need to get down to a more reasonable number of projects being studied within a zone. And we might be studying more than the area deliverability network upgrades in that area can handle at some margin, rather than trying to reach exactly the amount that's been identified in the resource planning process. So these two processes do need to move forward in parallel. There's more discussion going on about what constitutes a zone inside the IPE effort. And that's why we said this criteria around separating an area deliverability network upgrade from a local upgrade might need to be revisited or might change itself again as the interconnection process enhancements effort moves forward. So I'm afraid at this time, I don't think we can tell you exactly how this will be applied in the IPE effort, because it's not done yet. That's a work in progress about how that would evolve. But clearly there's a desire to keep these two processes integrated and linked so that we can focus more quickly on the projects that are moving forward in the areas where the big area network upgrades are moving forward. So, like I said, we're having to address the issues here that we identify, but also recognizing that more change to this issue may be forthcoming as the IPE effort moves forward. Danielle, did you want to chime in on that at all?
No, I think you covered it well, Neil. I think,
okay,
like you said, it's going to be refined further in the IPE initiative.
Yeah.
Okay, so as a follow-up, what I'm understanding is that the changes are being used in the TPP process with the transmission interconnection zone numbers, deriving those numbers. Changes to the generation deliverability methodology will be used in the upcoming, not the 2023, 2024, but the subsequent TPP processes.
Yeah, I mean, the area constraints are the main information that are fed to the transmission planning process. So to the extent that this adjustment changes the area constraints slightly, then that will they'll flow through the transition planning process. I think that.
Yeah, and thanks, Robert, for clarifying that. All I was getting at was, as well as that in the IPE effort itself, it may result in more changes that would also then flow through into the transmission planning process.
Okay, most appreciate your response. Thank you very much.
All right, that's all we have for questions.
Okay, next slide, please. So this is the last topic. As previously discussed, currently a generator must wait for all reliability and deliverability network upgrades to be in service before it can receive SCDS. And the ISO understands the disruptions resulting from delayed upgrades and proposed the idea of providing conditional deliverability when delivery network upgrades are delayed. Next slide, please. So generally, stakeholders all supported the idea of providing deliverability when upgrades are delayed and asked the ISO to provide more detail on how this would be implemented. Next slide. So the ISO understands that delayed transmission upgrades can result in resource development owners missing their PPA deadlines, and this can result in PPA counterparty not meeting RA requirements, forcing it to procure a different alternative resource at higher cost. However, the issue of delayed network upgrades is a big issue and not limited to delivery network upgrades. It also impacts reliability network upgrades are actually probably more frequently the problem. Further internal discussion and legal review within the ISO revealed that this is not simply a technical issue that is within the scope of the Deliverability Study Methodology Review Initiative, as the proposal inherently relaxed not only the criteria for deliverability, but in effect relaxed the need for resource adequacy resources to meet minimum operational delivery needs. The issue of delayed reliability and delivery network upgrades should be explored in the IPE process and will need to be coordinated with other policy venues and industry efforts to address concerns with the pace of resource and transmission development. So that's it on this last item. Are there any questions?
Let's move to Dariush.
Hello, Robert. You touched on a very critical point, and that is delays in upgrades, whatever category they happen to be. And of course, sometimes, a lot of times these delays are known well in advance of the year of operation for the resource. We typically hear from PTOs that an upgrade which was supposed to be completed in 3 years from now will be completed in 6 years from now. If a delay that was the upgrade was supposed to be completed in 2 years from now is going to be done in 5 years from now. And the only way that the resource would have to determine whether it can start operation on the year that's in its PPA or it had it on its GIA, signed GIA, is to wait until 9 months before, based on if the new tariff goes through, 9 months before COD, and then ask that question. And as you know, that's way too late. I mean, 9 months before the time the results come back, it's 5 months, bro, and you cannot do much with that type of result. Most footprints, most jurisdictions allow people to ask for operational studies in which the transmission system operator will perform studies for future years to determine whether a project, at least in those cases, typically almost any condition that is requested, but at least in this case, is it possible for CAISO to consider performing some sort of operational study at the time that the PTO declares a delay in an upgrade, whether reliability upgrade or deliverability upgrade, and so that a project can say, okay, if I come at that time, 3 years from now, if I come online with these upgrades being delayed to 5 years from now, I can operate maybe 200 megawatt rather than my 500 megawatt. I can start operation with 200 megawatt, both for benefit, my benefit and the benefit of my off-taker who needs my RA capacity or needs my energy. Is there anything in the offing or being considered by CAISO to offer these, they sometimes called optional studies, operational studies, aside from limited operation study that's done 9 months before COD, so that you can, projects which are in this, get caught in this predicament, and the off-taker who are caught out in this predicament could come in several years before, and so that they can continue the construction activities and come online, as opposed to potentially going out of business.
So, Darius, it's Neil here. I should probably take that one because, to be blunt, the overall issue about maintaining the pace of new transmission development to support new resource development over the next literally 10 to 20 years, that is moving to being one of our highest priority concerns. The planning process coordinated with the CPUC's resource IRP process seems to be now getting us on the right track for project approvals, but we recognize that this is going to be basically a steady treadmill of new transmission development needing to be leading and moving forward in support of the steady pace of new resources getting connected. And well, we've been looking primarily at now integrating our interconnection process into that resource planning, the overall coordination of procurement and construction timelines, sustaining that pace of year-over-year development is one of our biggest challenges. So we do see needing to explore different ways to keep projects moving forward and to manage when there are disruptions with transmission projects being delayed. The Transmission Development Forum was a good start in providing some visibility. I think we're often surprised at how few questions come up when those delays are being announced, but we do see needing to move forward with a broader effort focusing on what can we do and what can the industry do to provide that certainty going forward and help ensure that we're actually on that right trajectory of new transmission development in support of resources. Clearly, that's the goal, is that we need to add collectively, we need to add a lot of new resources to the system every year, and they need to have transmission upgrades to support them. So that is why one of the reasons why we see needing to move this particular. This was a solution perhaps born out of some frustration with some of the more recent delays that have been experienced, but it needs a more holistic look at what we do to get on the right track. What you're suggesting around further out limited operation type studies, that might have a home. Right now, the challenge there has been just with so many projects in the queue at the same time. Trying to comment about the impact on any one project or one interconnection customer's resource is a challenge. So, but these are issues we want to look at. We want to look at them next year on how we can do to sort that out. But I don't think there's going to be a one silver bullet solution. But we do need to look at how to better manage the impacts, preferably to avoid the delays in the first place. But beyond that, what can we do to manage any delays?
I would like to applaud, as I work with many developers, I would like to applaud what you have been doing at CAISO to help with these rampant delays that are popping up everywhere. People do not raise those issues in transmission forum because they don't want to talk about their projects in public, typically. But then they come to you, and you really go out of your way to help, and I really appreciate that. Yeah, some holistic thinking is definitely needed in that regard.
Yeah, but I appreciate that, Dariush, and I think dealing with them as one-offs is going to be a tough way to maintain the total volume that we need. So we do need, I think, more structured approaches to help pave the way with the end goal of getting projects connected. That's the job here. Okay. All right. So.
All right. That's all we have for questions.
Yeah, I think I'll hand it off to Neil on the next slide.
Or I think Danielle was going to cover.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Somebody.
So we have posted the draft final proposal, and comments are due 2 weeks from today on November 27th. And then we do plan to take this issue to the Board of Governors this winter, most likely in December. I do want to note that none of the changes in the proposed draft final proposal require Board of Governor approval. Most of them are changes to the deliverability. Most of them are changes to the ISO management functions. We do anticipate needing to change at least one item in the business practice manual, so keep an eye out for that. And then our report to the board will be mostly informational rather than having them adopt any changes. And then we will also make these changes in time to help inform IPE Track 2. And as mentioned before, there will likely be an additional track of IPE to address some of the broader deliverability issues that we've discussed today, recognizing that some of those deliverability challenges associated with delayed network upgrades kind of extend beyond just the interconnection process and are slightly more systemic, but there may be mitigations that can be addressed in some of the ISO initiatives. And I believe that's all. Caitlin, I don't know if you have a final slide you want to address.
Yeah, let's move to the last slide. So just before we close out the meeting, Neil, Danielle, or Robert, any final remarks?
I don't think so. Just look forward to comments. Yeah.
Okay, we did have a last-minute hand raised, so maybe we can take that question. Nancy Rader, go ahead. And then producer, can we unmute her line?
Okay, hi there, Nancy Rader with Calwea. I thought I saw in an early slide that there was a FERC tariff filing contemplated. Is that not the case?
I don't believe we need to file any changes with FERC. We can get confirmation of that though.
I think that was on your early slide, but thanks.
All right. Well then, there's no other questions today. So to close out the meeting, written comments are due November 27th. We'll have a comment template posted shortly. And then to access that template for the comments, you can access that through the initiative webpage. That hyperlink is there in the second bullet point. And if you have any questions or need any help accessing the commenting tool, you can email isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for all of our panelists today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for joining today's conference. You may now disconnect.